context here is the resurgence of the M23 movement, and this is one of the 100 rebel movements that have been fighting the government of Kinshasa in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And this rebel movement began in 2012, and it was pushed back out of Goma back then, but has resurfaced again. And this time has taken over Goma and is actually in the process of threatening a second city, Kavumu, right now. And the leader of the M23 has actually said that ultimately they're looking to eventually move their forces and take over Kinshasa and to replace the government in Kinshasa with one that would be favorable to themselves. So it's a very difficult situation. We have to also remember the human cost of this. We have over 500,000 people who've been displaced, and about 1 million people who fled to Goma to run away from the fighting, and those people have been displaced. And in addition to that, we have the foreign peacekeepers, the SADC forces. We had some troops from Malawi who were killed. We had about 13 South African troops who were killed in fighting with the M23. And the last element of this is also the diplomatic one, where the tension between Pretoria, South African President Cyril Ramaphosa, and Kigali under President Paul Kagame, have been exchanging very harsh words, while President Tshisekedi has refused to come to the negotiating table with the M23 rebels. So it's a very volatile political but also military situation right now that has very unfortunate humanitarian costs. I think it's a bit of a mixture of both of those, and you have to add the impact of neighboring countries, which are also heavily interested for strategic but also economic reasons. Absolutely. In generating what I'd call these economies of violence that are related to a lot of the minerals that are in the DRC. So you referred to the 2009 agreement under Kabila, which the current Tshisekedi government has rejected, saying that it's not in the national interests of the DRC to integrate the M23 into the DRC army. And the M23 rebels have said they do not want to give up strategic areas that they have occupied. Let's not forget the M23 the Congolese Tutsis who have ethnic or co-ethnic relatives across the border in Rwanda with the Rwandese Tutsis. So there's an ethnic element there. But I think part of the challenge with the diplomatic front is that Tshisekedi cannot or does not want to negotiate with the M23, because if the DRC government sit at the same table with the M23, that gives M23 recognition, diplomatic and political recognition. It strengthens the hand of the M23. And Kinshasa does not want to do that at all costs. In addition to that, Tshisekedi is also facing a lot of political pressure to stand up to Rwanda and to eliminate the M23. This was one of the central elements of his election. And you'd remember this is why we had the riots a few days ago and attacks on the embassies in Kinshasa. So he's also facing a lot of domestic pressure to deal with the M23 situation. On the other hand, we also have the strategic interests of Rwanda and Paul Kagame. And because President Tshisekedi has refused to implement the accord that was agreed on by President Kabila, Rwanda feels that there is an existentialist threat of the FDLR, which are the former Hutu Interhamwe rebels who are resident in the eastern part of the DRC. And Rwanda is using the M23 as a proxy, as a conduit to act as a buffer to go after the FDLR. So on the Rwandan side, they see Kinshasa's reluctance to implement the accord with Kabila as a national security threat to Rwanda, because ultimately the Kagame administration feels that if the Hutu rebels through the FDLR are able to regroup in the DRC, then eventually they will invade Rwanda and we might have another cycle of massacres. So this is a very complicated, political and diplomatic situation. And we cannot also, as we talk about the M23, forget about the other 120 other rebel groups like the Mai Mai, the ADF, that are also present in the eastern part of the DRC. And Uganda, for example, has an interest in also eliminating the ADF, who have been engaged in terrorist attacks in Kampala. So it's a very, very complicated matrix. And also given the fact that we have foreign interventions, not only through SADC, we have the MONUSCO troops, and they were trying to pull out, but have gotten caught up in this situation. And, we've had diplomatic efforts through the East African community, through President Ruto of Kenya, that were rejected by the DRC. Tshisekedi refused to turn up. So it's a very complicated and difficult situation, but there's interest on both the side of Kinshasa and Kigali that do not want to reconcile or move to a diplomatic angle. Rwanda feels that it has the upper hand on the ground because the rebels have captured Goma and they are threatening Kinshasa. And Kinshasa does not want to engage in diplomacy because I don't mean recognizing the M23. And Kinshasa feels that weakens its diplomatic position. So that's really the impasse we are at this point. Yes, exactly right. When we think about the diplomatic front, we had the East African Community Force, which was in the DRC, but was welcomed to leave by President Tshisekedi, and the East African Force left. Yeah. And then we had the SADC troops, which went into the DRC. And are currently there. And now we've had the M23 directly attacking the SADC forces. And as I'd mentioned earlier, that some Malawi peacekeepers and South African peacekeepers have actually been killed. And the challenge here is that, we have multiple diplomatic processes that are not always coordinated effectively or reconciled with and between each other. And by that I mean, originally we had the Nairobi process, which was led by former President Uhuru Kenyatta. And now we have the Luanda process, which seems to have been the forward or more aggressive diplomatic process. And the Nairobi process was kept on the back burner. And the Luanda process was led by President Urenco. And so the challenge here is we have multiple diplomatic initiatives to attempt to reconcile or bring peace to the situation. We have peacekeepers from countries that have interests in the DRC. The suggestion that South Africa is intervening on behalf of mining interests in the eastern DRC. We know SADC right now is hopelessly divided. We know the recent emergency meeting in Harare was boycotted by Mozambique because Mozambique has Rwandese troops in Cabo Delgado that are protecting offshore oil mining in Mozambique. So Mozambique does not want to anger the administration in Kigali by appearing to be going too close with SADC. And these multiple diplomatic initiatives, the recent effort in Harare and the foiled effort led by President Ruto, I think it really further complicates not only the Luanda process, but the stalled Nairobi process, which was being led by President Uhuru Kenyatta. I must also add that lack of intervention or the ambiguity of the UN and the frustration of the Congolese with the MONUSCO force, which has been there for over 24 years, with trying to, to settle this situation, further complicates, matters in the DRC, particularly when we consider that UN peacekeepers were trying to move out of the DRC, and now these rebels are moving in. So what that really raises a question also is there a question around timing of why are these rebels attacking Goma now? Why now? Might it be that, they know that there's this division within SADC, that they know there's a weakness because the East African force has left and MONUSCO is also leaving, but also a broader international geopolitical map where maybe the M23 and their backers in Kigali have felt that the world's attention is more focused on problems in Syria and problems in Ukraine, between Ukraine and Russia, and that maybe Rwanda could advance its interests while there's this current element of disarray. Unfortunately, the current situation really portends to the possibility of having another African world war, like we had with the first effort to remove the Mobutu regime, which led to the installation of Kabila, the second Congo War, and this now possibly could go into a third Congo War, which could be very devastating because of all the different interests involved. So I don't see an easy diplomatic solution. And I say that, one, if you think of it economically and strategically, because of these economies of violence. There are so many foreign countries. We're looking at Uganda here. We're looking at Rwanda that have an interest in the chaos that goes on in the DRC right now, because they are then able to extract some of these rare minerals, gold, coltan, which you mentioned is very instrumental in, manufacture of cell phones, and some of these rare minerals that are also used within the electro vehicle, manufacture, which are only found in large quantities in the DRC. So there's questions of these economies of violence that are related to neighboring countries like Uganda and Rwanda that have an interest in the extraction of those minerals. So there's an economic angle to it, to this generation of economic economies of violence that lead to the problems from outside powers. But we also have to consider, before we talk about the diplomacy, some of the internal contradictions in the DRC. And what do I mean by that? There are elements of the Congolese army that also benefit when there's chaos in the eastern DRC. Many of the soldiers in the Congo army have not been paid but for many, many months. And the only way they benefit is by supporting some of these rebel groups to extract these rare minerals and trade with the Congolese army, so that the generals in the Congolese army are also benefiting. So there's an internal weakness even within the Congolese army. They're not only involved in extraction of some of these minerals, but they also are not appropriately supported from Kinshasa to fight and to protect or bring order within the eastern DRC, within the borders of the DRC. So there's internal problems even within the Congo. The Congo looks like a huge country, and you would think that it should easily be able to defeat Rwanda. But if you actually travel in the eastern DRC, and I've been there several times, to Goma, the economy of Goma is actually very much tied to East Africa and the Eastern African countries, where it's Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, and Tanzania, than it does to Kinshasa. In other words, the Kinshasa government's control of this region, because the country is so big, is very weak. And I say that to say the diplomatic front will be very challenging to bring all these powers together. So, for example, how do you convince Kagame to stop extracting these rare minerals from the Eastern DRC? How do you convince him to leave the Eastern DRC, stop supporting the M23, when Kagame knows that the FDLR and the former Interhamwe are regrouping in the Eastern DRC and would use those very minerals to launch a counterinsurgency and attack Rwanda? So Kagame would not be willing to stop supporting M23 until he's sure that the FDLR has been sufficiently dealt with. And the government in Kinshasa cannot or will not stop supporting the FDLR, the former Interhamwe, either because the government in Kinshasa is too weak, or they also have strategic interests in the chaos that's going on in that region. So to answer your question, what about the diplomacy? I think major powers, be there the United States, France, Belgium, that have major multinationals, that operate in that region, I think they can really put diplomatic pressure on countries like Rwanda that have aid, that get a lot of aid from these foreign countries, to say that President Kagame needs to be a good regional player. He needs to ensure that he's not supporting the M23, which is creating so much chaos. But I think diplomatically, also from Kinshasa, the international community should ensure that the Tshisekedi administration is supporting the army, and that they actually have a disciplined army that can control their borders. Because right now, the Congolese army is extremely weak, extremely corrupt, and very divided. And as you saw when the M23 came into Goma, a lot of the army of the DRC, ran away, took off their uniforms, and abandoned, the military objective of protecting their country. So you cannot have a diplomatic solution without security and a strategic military settlement on the ground. And this is why I think this situation will get worse, unfortunately, before it gets better, particularly when the head of the M23 is saying that they want to go all the way to Kinshasa, and the foreign minister of Rwanda is on record on saying that they are ready to fight. So they are ready to take on SADC and the South African troops. So it's a very complicated and difficult situation, and unfortunately, I don't see the diplomacy adding up, because there's just too many countries that are interested in the minerals in the DRC, and most of the major powers are more concerned with other flashpoints. In this case, the situation in Syria, in the Middle East, and also the crisis between Ukraine and Russia, in Ukraine. Very definitely. We say in international affairs, ultimately, countries are motivated by their own strategic interests. So whereas, the United States, France, Belgium, Rwanda, Uganda, even the DRC, they may be saying one thing at the negotiating table. Yeah. Ultimately, you have to follow the money, right? You have to follow their strategic interests. Many of these countries, US multinationals, French companies, Belgian companies, Israeli companies, as we mentioned, Rwanda, regulating the M23, Uganda's influence over some of these factions. These different countries have very strategic interests in generating these economies of violence, right, and controlling these strategic minerals. But ultimately, the crisis in the DRC is a DRC question because the region, Eastern DRC, is within the jurisdiction of Kinshasa, of the Tshisekedi administration. And I think as president, Tshisekedi has just not done enough to bring security to that region, because ultimately the Eastern DRC is the responsibility of the DRC, not Rwanda, not United States, not Belgium and France. And I think as long as Kinshasa continues to blame the M23 without supporting its army, its military, to be able to control and regulate its borders, this crisis will not end. Other foreign interests will continue to manipulate different factions and rebel bodies within the area. Remember, there's over 100. The M23 is just the most well supported by Rwanda. But I don't think unless Kinshasa gets its game in order and actually ensures that it has a strong military in the region and it's able to regulate its borders, that will be the only situation where the Tshisekedi administration would be able then to go to the negotiating table from a strong position to negotiate with President Kagame. Because if you really look at the fundamentals of diplomacy here, there's no incentive for Rwanda to want to negotiate with the DRC at this point, because Rwanda already occupies significant territory of the DRC and has taken over Goma. And these rebels could actually go all the way to Kinshasa, the way they did with the first Congo War to topple the Mobutu administration. How regional players will get involved going forward, I think, will be really interesting. To think, for example, about like I said, will the Kinshasa administration send more troops and better equipped troops to fight for Congolese territory? As it is right now, they haven't done a good job about it. They've subcontracted national security to foreign mercenaries. And I think you recently saw the Romanian, mercenaries who were captured by Kigali, by Rwanda. That tells you the Congolese army is in complete and total disarray. And DRC really needs to make sure that it has a handle over that. I think the other element of what we need to think about here is what will the role of Angola be? Because Angola borders, the DRC, has not sent any troops to the DRC. But, Angolan army is a very strong army because for over 40 years they were fighting UNITA. So these are very battle-hardened troops. Will Angola intervene strategically to save the Tshisekedi administration? Also, what will Zambia look to do in this situation? We know Chad also has an interest in the region. We know Cameroon is a player in the region. We know Central African Republic is a player in the region, even though Central African Republic has its own problems. So going forward, I think the SADC bloc will really need to speak with one voice as it intervenes in this situation. Because, again, unfortunately, I have to say, there has to be a military solution to this question before you can negotiate at the diplomatic table, because the region is awash with weapons and it's awash with all these different militia groups, and you cannot talk diplomacy. You can't make peace at the diplomatic table when there's killing and shooting going on all over. There has to be peace, which has to be brought back through a military solution, unfortunately, before we have, diplomatic talks. And I don't see, as I said earlier, the UN being actively involved in this current situation, because MONUSCO has already been invited out of the country, so they are leaving. Washington right now, President Trump is in a situation or an America First foreign policy, which is non-interventionist, which is neo-isolationist. Yeah. He's not interested in getting involved in foreign wars. He's pulled out of Afghanistan, U.S. troops out of Syria. He wants to end this war, with Russia and Ukraine. So the U.S. might not really see a strategic interest to want to send U.S. troops or fund a UN mission in the Eastern DRC, just because Trump is focusing on America first. So again, it's a very complex situation, but unfortunately, I feel that there will have to be a military solution on the ground to either pacify the rebels or change the regime in Kinshasa before we have a diplomatic solution. And how the regional players will get engaged with that, I think will be something to observe as we go forward. When I talk about a military solution, I'm talking about a strengthening of the SADC force. So it doesn't necessarily mean all-out war, but the military option needs to be on the table as an incentive to encourage all parties to come to the negotiating table, right? So I'm really talking about the coercive element of the threat of military force. Yeah. So if SADC is strong, if the M23 know that they cannot overthrow the government in Kinshasa, that SADC is willing and ready to confront the M23 and bring a military solution to actually have peace and fix the humanitarian situation, I think M23 and Rwanda will be more incentivized to have a diplomatic solution. But as long as Kinshasa is weak, as long as SADC is divided, and the M23 know that there's a good chance they can make it all the way militarily to Kinshasa and have regime change, then we're going to have an escalation of this situation. So I think for me, before we talk the diplomacy, we need to fix the security question. And I think bolstering SADC will be one of the ways to do that. And whether we can do that, I think then is the next question. How regionally will that be engaged? Otherwise, as long as M23 continues to see the chaos, the weakness of the DRC army, the DRC army running away and not ready to confront and fight for their country, I think there's more of an incentive of Rwanda to give even more support to M23 to overthrow the regime in Kinshasa. And unfortunately, I think if we get to that angle, we'll actually see more bloodshed and more displacement. So I think there should be more diplomacy, but more of an emphasis to strengthen the military hand of SADC in order to force the M23 and Rwanda to the negotiating table. Because the status quo right now is not incentivized. It's not a good space to encourage the M23 to engage in diplomacy because they already have such a strong hand on the ground. Remember, they'll be electing an African Union chair. Absolutely. So that will be very significant. Mm-hmm. But I think fundamentally, will the AU actually have a common voice? Will SADC as a region be able to have a common voice about this DRC situation to isolate Rwanda and actually have a diplomatic solution? We know historically the AU has been very weak in terms of intervening in crisis on the continent, right? The DRC has gone on for many years. Sudan, as we know, is in a lot of issues. Libya. Yeah. So will we have an African common voice when we come to the AU?